Welcome to Starbound. My name is Chikondi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please quickly check below to see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free, and it just helps make sure that our videos pop up in your feed more often. Sunlight glinted off silicate trees as something massive crashed through the violet undergrowth. The ground trembled with each impact of its 6 clawed feet, while its segmented body rippled with muscle beneath chitinous armor. 2 sets of mandibles clicked and clattered, dripping with venom that sizzled against the strange flora. Ahead of the beast, a lone figure walked along a winding path. His deep crimson robes caught the alien world's orange sunlight, the fabric seeming to flow like liquid metal with each measured step. A blade hung at his hip, its sheath unmarked by wear despite its obvious age. His gait never changed as the monster approached, each footfall landing with the same deliberate precision. The creature burst from the rocky forest with a shriek that shattered several nearby. It towered over the robed figure, mass enough to crush him with a single step. Venom dripped from foot-long fangs as it reared up, casting its shadow over the seemingly oblivious prey. Still, the figure's pace remained unchanged. His hands rested loosely at his sides, though his right thumb had shifted almost imperceptibly closer to his sword's guard. The beast struck, mandibles wide enough to swallow him whole. In the instant before impact, the figure finally moved. His blade cleared its sheath in a flash of metal too quick to follow. The monster's charge carried it past him as he stepped aside, his sword describing a perfect arc through the air. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the creature's head slid free from its body, both parts continuing forward with the momentum of its attack. The figure was already sheathing his blade before the separate pieces hit the ground. A slight furrow appeared in his brow as he observed his fallen opponent. His shoulders dropped a fraction in what might have been disappointment. One hand absently brushed an invisible speck of dust from his robes as he resumed his walk, steps still measured and precise. A chime sounded from within his robes. He withdrew a small device, its advanced technology at odds with his traditional garments. Data scrolled across its surface, coordinates, sensor readings, analysis of primitive technology detected on a newly discovered world. His expression shifted minutely as he read. The furrow in his brow eased, replaced by the slightest arch of interest. For the first time, his next step fell just slightly out of rhythm with its predecessors. The device vanished back into his robes as he changed direction, heading toward where his ship waited in a nearby clearing. Behind him, the massive creature's body still twitched, blood pooling beneath its cleanly severed neck. The cut was so precise it might have been made by a surgical laser rather than a blade. But if Blade Master Wu Jian took pride in such victory, he made no show of it. Whatever his ship's sensors had detected seemed to better hold his interest. The alien sun cast long shadows through the silicate greens as he walked away, his blade still clean despite the morning's work. Space stretched and warped around the Blade Master's vessel as it carved its path through the void. The ship's clean lines and sweeping curves mimicked the elegant simplicity of his blade, its navigation systems requiring no crew beyond their single passenger. The Blade Master sat in quiet meditation, his sword across his knees as stars streaked past the viewports. The ship's warning systems activated with a soft chime. 3 vessels had dropped out of hyperspace, their weapons already charged. The largest bore obvious signs of modification, armor plates welded haphazardly across its hull, weapon mounts added without regard for aesthetics or balance. A pirate vessel, accompanied by its similarly crude escorts. The Blade Master did not move from his meditation as a tractor beam locked onto his ship. His breathing remained steady as the pirates dragged his vessel into their hold. Even when the larger ship's artificial gravity took hold, he showed no reaction to the shift in orientation. Heavy boots thundered across metal decking as armed figures surrounded his ship. Their equipment was as mismatched as their vessel, a hodgepodge of stolen military gear and civilian modifications. Plasma rifles hummed as they charged, targeting systems painting his hull with dozens of tracking beams. The ship's hatch opened with a soft hiss. The Blade Master descended the boarding ramp with the same measured steps he had used on the alien world. His crimson robes caught the harsh lights of the hangar bay, flowing like liquid metal around his feet. Recognition dawned in the pirate's eyes. Several weapons dipped toward the deck as their owners took involuntary steps backward. The leader's fingers tightened on his rifle's grip, knuckles white beneath dirty gloves. The Blade Master's gaze swept across their arsenal with the same subtle furrow that had marked his encounter with the beast. His right thumb shifted a fraction closer to his sword's guard. The pirate leader's mouth opened, perhaps to offer surrender or attempt negotiation. The Blade Master's blade cleared its sheath before the first sound could form. 20 armed criminals stood in that hangar bay. 20 trigger fingers tensed on 20 weapons. 20 pairs of eyes tracked the silver arc of the blade. 20 bodies hit the deck in perfect unison, each bearing a single precise cut. Not one had fired a shot. The Blade Master was already sheathed as he returned to his ship's ramp. His steps never quickened, never slowed. The hatch sealed behind him with the same soft hiss as before. Moments later, his vessel slipped free of the pirate's tractor beam. Its navigation systems resumed their original course as if nothing had interrupted their journey. Behind it, the massive pirate ship hung motionless in space, its crew no longer able to pursue anyone. Inside his ship, the Blade Master resumed his meditation. His sword lay across his knees, its edge as clean as ever. The stars continued to streak past the viewports as the vessel carried him toward his destination. Twin moons painted the landscape in conflicting shadows as the Blade Master's ship settled onto red-tinged soil. A hot wind carried the scent of strange spices and unfamiliar flowers, whistling through rock formations that spiraled up from the ground like frozen tentacles. The world's dense atmosphere bent starlight into rainbow halos around the moons, while bioluminescent insects traced lazy patterns through the thick air. His boots left clear impressions in the soft earth as he descended the boarding ramp. The higher gravity made each step require slightly more effort, though nothing in his posture betrayed this adjustment. Local vegetation rustled at his passage, thick, rope-like vines covered in fine sensory filaments that recoiled from his proximity. The air tasted of copper and ozone. The settlement appeared through gaps in the twisted rock formations. Simple structures of cured hide stretched over frames of local wood analog, arranged in spiral patterns that mimicked the natural stone. The natives were tall, willowy beings with 4 arms and skin that shifted colors like oil on water. They moved with an almost hypnotic grace, their elongated limbs flowing through forms that suggested years of martial training. One of them noticed his approach. The being's skin rippled with warning patterns, bands of red and yellow racing across its surface. Others took up defensive positions, their movements displaying the coordinated precision of experienced warriors. The Blade Master's thumb shifted minutely closer to his sword's guard, though his steps never faltered. Their chosen champion stepped forward, skin now a deep blue that matched the ceremonial wrappings around its 4 arms. A blade of polished bone extended from each hand, their edges honed to molecular sharpness by generations of careful craft. The being's movements spoke of decades of dedication to its art, each stance flowing perfectly into the next. For the first time since landing, the Blade Master's pace changed. He stopped precisely 5 steps from his opponent, head tilting a fraction of a degree as he assessed the warrior's form. His right hand moved to his sword's grip with deliberate slowness, allowing the native time to prepare its own weapons. The being attacked with impressive speed, 4 bone blades describing precise arcs through the charged air. Local insects scattered in glowing clouds as the warriors danced beneath the twin moons. The native's technique was complex, each of its 4 arms moving independently in attacks that would have overwhelmed any normal opponent. The blade cleared its sheath once. 4 bone weapons clattered to the ground, their wielder staggering back with wounds so precise they had cauterized instantly. The native's skin shifted to pale green, perhaps shock, perhaps surrender. Its fellows moved to support their fallen champion, their own colors muted to deep blues and purples. The Blade Master was already walking away, his blade returning to its sheath with a soft click that echoed off the spiral stone formations. His steps carried him back toward his ship with the same measured pace as always. The strange wind pulled at his crimson robes as local wildlife slowly resumed its activities around him. Seasons changed. The twin moons traced new patterns across the sky as vegetation bloomed and withered in cycles. The natives developed new techniques, incorporating technology from other worlds, and advanced beyond their primitive origins as other species arrived at the same call as the Blade Master. The Blade Master's ship remained sealed until the day another signal caught his attention. Without ceremony or farewell, the vessel lifted off through the rainbow-haloed starlight. Its clean lines vanished into the upper atmosphere, leaving only boot prints in red soil that would soon be erased by the spice-scented wind. Behind him, the native champion's wounds had healed into scars so fine they were nearly invisible. Its 4 arms moved through training forms with the same dedication as before, but its skin never again shifted to the deep blue of combat readiness. Some lessons, it seemed, needed only one teaching. Cherry blossoms drifted on the morning breeze, their pale petals catching dawn light as they spiraled down from ancient trees. Mountains rose through banks of mist in the distance, their slopes dotted with temples whose curved roofs gleamed with morning dew. The air carried hints of cedar and incense from nearby shrines, mixing with the earthy scent of fresh-tilled rice paddies in the valleys below. The Blade Master's ship settled into a secluded grove, its advanced hull dispersing the flower petals in gentle eddies. Local birds called in alarm at the intrusion before settling back to their morning songs. A stream chattered over smooth stones nearby, its clean scent mixing with the sweetness of seasonal blooms. His boots whispered against the grass as he emerged, crimson robes now adorned with subtle patterns that mimicked local styles. The ship's hull shimmered and vanished behind him, its cloaking systems rendering it invisible to primitive eyes. Only the continued dispersal of falling petals marked its presence. The first challenger appeared before midday, a warrior in lacquered armor, his own blade drawing clean lines through the morning mist. The Blade Master's sword cleared its sheath, flashed once, then returned. The warrior's armor fell away in precise cut sections, leaving him unharmed but thoroughly defeated. As the sun climbed higher, he met a master of the spear in a bamboo grove. The weapon's reach advantage meant nothing. One stroke severed its shaft, while another removed its wielder's topknots. The spearman knelt in acknowledgement of his defeat, forehead pressed to the ground, still wet with morning dew. Afternoon brought a duel on a moon-viewing bridge, its wooden planks still strong despite centuries of weather. The local swordsman's technique was refined, his stance perfect, his strikes true. The Blade Master's blade wove through his guard like water flowing downstream, ending the match with a cut so precise it trimmed the warrior's sleeve without breaking skin. Evening saw him tested against a renowned Blade Master in a temple courtyard. Monks paused in their work to watch as the local expert demonstrated techniques passed down through generations of careful study. The Blade Master's response left the man's prayer beads scattered across stone worn smooth by countless sandaled feet. With each victory, his movements gained a fraction more energy. Each clash lasted slightly longer. Each opponent demonstrated skills that would have made them legends in any other context. The furrow in his brow eased with each passing duel, though only his brow ever changed. Night fell. Lantern light cast warm pools between ancient buildings as crickets took up their evening chorus. The Blade Master's steps carried him along a dirt road between flowering trees, their branches swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. Stars began to peek through breaks in the clouds, their light competing with the rising moon. Another figure appeared through the gathering darkness, a solitary warrior walking the opposite direction, his own robes catching starlight as he moved. No armor adorned his form, though a blade hung at his hip with the same practiced grace as the Blade Master's own. Their paths would intersect in exactly 27 steps. The soft dirt muffled their footfalls as they drew closer, neither changing pace nor acknowledging the other's presence. Cherry blossoms continued to fall around them, dancing in the gentle evening wind. In the distance, a temple bell tolled the hour. Its deep resonance carried over the valley, mixing with cricket song and the rustling of leaves. The two swordsmen's shadows stretched toward each other in the moonlight as they approached their inevitable meeting. The space between them shrank with each measured step. Moonlight painted their shadows in stark relief against the packed earth, the dark shapes drawing ever closer like the hands of some great celestial clock. A night bird called once from the darkness and fell silent, as if sensing the gravity of this encounter. 20 steps remained. The samurai's left hand hung loose at his side, though his thumb brushed the edge of his robe with each stride. The motion pulled the fabric back just enough to reveal the worn silk wrappings on his sword's hilt, evidence of countless hours. The Blade Master's own grip had created similar marks on his weapon's handle, visible only to eyes trained to notice such. 15 steps. Their gaits told stories of their training. The samurai's feet rolled smoothly from heel to toe, distributing his weight perfectly with each stride. No wasted energy, no telegraphed intention. The Blade Master's own steps matched this efficiency precisely, as if they moved to the same unheard rhythm. 10 steps. A slight breeze caught their robes, revealing glimpses of how each warrior moved beneath the flowing fabric. The samurai's motions spoke of techniques perfected through decades of dedication, while the Blade Master's stride carried centuries of refinement. As the cherry blossoms drifted between them, some caught briefly on sword hilts before being carried away. 5 steps. The angle of the samurai's right shoulder told of an old wound, long healed but still affecting his draw. The Blade Master's own posture revealed similar stories, injuries taken, adjusted for, incorporated into evolving techniques. Each scar is a lesson written in flesh and bone. 3 steps. Their breathing remained steady, measured. The samurai's chest expanded slightly less on his right side, suggesting ribs that had once been broken and never set perfectly. The Blade Master's own breath whispered of similar tales, each warrior reading volumes in the smallest signs. 1 step remained. As their shoulders drew level, time seemed to slow. The moon's light caught the edge of the samurai's blade through its sheath, a weapon of extraordinary quality, though not equal to the Blade Master's own advanced materials. Both warriors knew such differences meant nothing in the hands of true masters. They passed each other with less than a hand's width of space between their shoulders. The air stirred by their movement caused their robes to brush briefly together, crimson silk meeting indigo cotton. For a fraction of a second, they inhabited the same space, breathed the same air, and existed in perfect symmetry. The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to its limit. In the distance, Wind-stirred chimes at a nearby shrine. Their crystalline notes floated across the evening air as both warriors took one more step away from each other, then another. Neither turned, neither spoke, neither gave any outward sign of recognition. But both knew, both understood. The weight of unspoken challenge hung between them like morning mist, heavy with deadly promise. Their next movement would shatter this perfect moment of assessment and transform their silent evaluation into lethal action. The cricket song faded, the wind stilled. Even the falling cherry blossoms seemed to pause in their descent. All of nature held its breath, waiting for the inevitable break in this exquisite tension. 10 steps separated them now, their backs turned to one another. The moon hung directly overhead, eliminating all shadows save the dark pools beneath their feet. A single cherry blossom drifted between them, spinning slowly in the still air. The Blade Master's right hand moved with glacial slowness toward his sword's hilt. The motion carried no wasted energy, no telegraphed intent, simply the perfect economy of movement that comes from centuries of practice. Beneath his crimson robes, crimson muscles coiled with precisely controlled tension. The samurai's own hand rose to mirror this motion, his movements carrying the same fluid grace. His breath remained steady, though his chest expanded slightly less with each inhale, muscles preparing, body aligning for what would come. The worn silk of his sword's handle blew breath against calloused palm. The falling blossom reached the midpoint between them. Their fingers curled around their respective hilts with identical pressure. The cricket song had ceased entirely now, as if nature itself dared not interrupt this moment with errant sound. Time stretched like heated glass, drawing out into an impossibly fine thread. The temperature seemed to drop, though neither warrior's breath showed in the chill air. Dew beaded on nearby grass, reflecting the moonlight like scattered diamonds. The blossom touched the earth. Neither warrior seemed to move. There was no drawn-out turn, no dramatic pivot, simply the liquid metal flash of two blades meeting in perfect counter to each other. The air itself appeared to tear where their weapons met, reality struggling to process the speed and precision of their strikes. They stood with backs to each other once more, poses mirror images of their initial positions. For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then a thin line of red appeared across the Blade Master's cheek, while behind him, the samurai sank slowly to his knees. Crimson bloomed across indigo robes as the samurai toppled forward. His blade fell from lifeless fingers, its edge still gleaming perfect and clean in the moonlight. His final breath stirred a few fallen petals, a sound so soft it barely disturbed the night's silence. The Blade Master's 3 fingers rose to touch the cut on his cheek. His expression shifted minutely, not quite a smile, but something close. For the first time since leaving his ship, his posture left its practiced form, a bow as deep as the breadth of a hair. He sheathed his blade and resumed walking, steps carrying him away from his fallen opponent with the same measured pace as before. But there was a subtle difference in his movement now, a fraction more energy in each stride. Behind him, the moonlight caught the samurai's fallen form. The warrior's final expression showed no pain or fear, only the serene acceptance of one who had found exactly what he sought. Cherry blossoms resumed their fall, gradually covering both victor and vanquished in a gentle blanket of pale petals. The night wind returned, carrying the distant sound of temple bells across the valley. Their deep tones seemed to toll not in mourning, but in celebration of this perfect moment of mastery meeting mastery. 2 paths had crossed, one had ended, but both had found what they sought in that singular flash of steel. Gray clouds hung low over ancient forests, their darkness broken by occasional shafts of pale sunlight. Mist clung to gnarled oak trees and weathered stones, turning the morning air thick with the scent of damp earth and moldering leaves. A raven's harsh call echoed across the landscape, answered by the distant toll of church bells. The Blade Master's ship descended through the cloud cover, water beading on its hull like mercury. Its landing stirred the mist into weird shapes, creating momentary phantoms that dissolved back into the general gloom. Drops of water fell from branches high above, each one striking fallen leaves with hollow percussion. His boots met soil very different from Japan's well-tended paths. Here the ground was rough, uneven, strewn with half-buried rocks and twisted roots. Old leaves formed a thick carpet that muffled his steps, though his pace remained as measured as ever. The fresh scar on his cheek caught the wan light as he surveyed his surroundings. The ship's hull rippled and vanished beneath him, its outline briefly visible as a distortion in the mist before disappearing entirely. Only the continuous drip of water from empty air marked its location. The Blade Master's crimson robes seemed to glow against the muted colors of this darker land, like fresh blood on old stone. A worn dirt track emerged from the gloom, its surface churned by cartwheels and hoofprints. Puddles filled the deeper ruts, their surfaces occasionally broken by falling drops from the canopy above. The path wound between ancient trees whose branches reached across it like grasping fingers, creating a tunnel of shadow and fog. Movement caught his eye, shapes in the mist that resolved into armed men. Their leather and iron spoke of warfare rather than art, their blades marked by practical use rather than careful preservation. They watched him pass with wary eyes, hands never straying far from hilts. The Blade Master's own stride never faltered, though his gaze took in every detail. The way these warriors wore their arms, the precise angle of their ready stances, the efficiency of their movements, all telling of a different approach to combat than he had found in the East. Their techniques were unrefined, yet undeniably effective, like uncut gems that still held deadly edges. More figures appeared through the fog as he walked. Some wore mail and plate, the metal dulled to reduce reflection. Others moved in lighter gear, emphasizing mobility over protection. All carried themselves with the unconscious readiness of those who lived by their blades. A stone bridge loomed ahead, its ancient arch rising through the mist like the spine of some giant beast. Water rushed beneath it, adding its voice to the constant drip of moisture from above. The structure's weathered surface bore the scars of old battles, telling tales of siege and storm in its pitted stonework. The Blade Master paused at the bridge's approach, head tilting a fraction as he studied its worn surface. Something in his posture suggested anticipation rather than wariness. The scar on his cheek caught the light again as his expression shifted subtly, showing a hint of the same interest he had found in Japan's filtered sunlight. His next step carried him onto the bridge's time-worn stones. Water dripped steadily into the rushing stream below, while ravens called back and forth through the mist. The fog began to thin, revealing more of the structure ahead, and whoever might wait upon it. Reality rippled around his ship one final time as its cloaking field fully engaged. The Blade Master was committed now to whatever this darker land might offer. His measured steps carried him forward into the mist, crimson robes a stark banner against the monotone gray of stone and sky. The first challenger met him in a monastery courtyard. Morning mist still clung to weathered stone as the armored figure saluted with a longsword, its steel catching what little sunlight penetrated the clouds. The warrior's plate armor gleamed dully, each piece fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. The Blade Master's blade cleared its sheath with liquid grace. His opponent's technique proved interesting, a mixture of leverage and geometry, using the sword's length to create angles of attack. But interest turned to disappointment as his own weapon slipped through a gap in the mathematical precision, ending the duel before the monastery's bells could toll the hour. Midday found him in a mud-churned practice yard. His opponent this time wore lighter armor, wielding a hand-and-a-half sword with swift aggression. The warrior's footwork showed promise, each step placed with calculated purpose despite the treacherous footing. The Blade Master's blade ended this display with even less effort than the first, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on the fallen warrior's sword. Afternoon brought rain and a new challenger in a forest clearing. This one fought with a bastard sword, switching grips with fluid ease. Water ran down plate armor in streams as the warrior demonstrated techniques meant to counter various weapons, adapting to different threats with practiced skill. The Blade Master's response proved that no adaptation could match true mastery. The rain continued as he met a sword master in a castle's great hall. Torchlight gleamed on wet stone as the warrior demonstrated techniques passed down through generations of careful study. The blade work was precise, each move built on decades of refinement, yet precision alone proved insufficient. The duel ended with the master's own blade pinned to a wooden door by the Blade Master's perfect strike. With each victory, his initial interest waned. His movements grew slightly less energetic, his stance returning to the same distant efficiency he had shown before reaching Japan. Even the rain seemed to mirror his mood, falling in a steady drizzle that muted all sound and color. Evening approached, though little change showed in the perpetually gray sky. The Blade Master's steps carried him along a muddy road between ancient trees, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. Water dripped steadily from his crimson robes, though his pace never faltered on the slick earth. His path led to another stone bridge, this one spanning a rain-swollen river whose waters churned angry and brown below. Moss grew thick between the ancient blocks, speaking to centuries of weathering wind and storm. The structure's time-worn surface held more signs of violence than its eastern counterparts. Deep gouges in the stone where steel had struck, edges crumbled by siege engines, repairs made with more concern for function than beauty. Something in the Blade Master's posture changed as he studied the bridge's weather-beaten arch. The steady rain had washed away all traces of earlier combat, leaving his blade as clean as ever in its sheath. But his hand moved fractionally closer to its hilt as he noted a dark figure standing at the bridge's center. The shadow resolved into a knight in black armor, the plate unmarked by any heraldry. No bright steel showed here. The metal had been blackened to prevent reflection, shaped for utility rather than ceremony. The warrior's sword remained sheathed, but the way they stood suggested no intention of yielding the bridge's narrow span. Rain continued to fall as the Blade Master took his first step onto ancient stone. Water ran in steady streams from the knight's dark armor, each drop adding its voice to the angry river below. Neither warrior moved further, as distance and shadow shrank between them. Rain drummed against the ancient stone as the two figures faced each other across the bridge's worn surface. Moss-slick rocks drew the eye downward to where the river crashed against the bridge's supports far below, its waters dark with storm runoff and debris. A flash of lightning painted everything in stark white for an instant, followed by thunder that shook loose stones from the aged mortar. The knight drew steel without ceremony or stance. The blade matched its wielder, dark, unadorned, forged for function over form. No light caught its edge through the gloom, as if the weapon consumed illumination rather than reflected it. The knight's armor creaked as they settled into a guard position that bore no resemblance to any school or style the Blade Master had encountered. Another lightning flash caught the scar on the Blade Master's cheek as his expression shifted to something approaching dismissal. His own blade cleared its sheath with familiar liquid grace, its perfect edge finally catching what little light penetrated the storm. His stance carried centuries of refinement, each muscle and sinew aligned with practiced precision. The knight's initial rush betrayed no technique or training that the Blade Master could recognize. The dark figure simply charged, blade held more like a bludgeon than a sword. The Blade Master's weapon rose in a perfect arc to meet this crude assault. Steel met steel with a sound like breaking glass. The Blade Master's flawless strike should have ended the engagement instantly. Instead, the knight's armored knee rose into his sternum as their blades locked. The impact drove air from his lungs and sent him staggering back a step on the slick stone. Lightning flashed again as the Blade Master recovered his stance. His expression showed the first hints of confusion as he reassessed his opponent. The knight pressed forward without hesitation, black armor shedding water in streams as they moved. Their blade work remained crude, almost primitive, yet somehow effective. The Blade Master's next sequence of strikes would have overwhelmed any traditional opponent. Each cut flowed perfectly into the next, creating a web of lethal steel that no conventional defense could counter. The knights simply lowered their shoulder and bowled through the pattern, letting their armor absorb what cuts they couldn't block. Their own blades swept in wild arcs that ignored all proper form. A precisely aimed strike from the Blade Master should have taken the knight's sword hand. Instead, the dark figure caught his blade against their gauntlet, the hardened steel grinding against perfect alien metallurgy. Their free hand, still gripping their sword, drove upward in a pommel strike that cracked against the Blade Master's jaw. Blood mixed with rain as the Blade Master fell back again. His perfect footwork found treacherous moss instead of solid stone. The knight's crude blade work followed him, giving no time to recover proper stance or form. Each exchange stripped away another layer of centuries-old certainty. Thunder shook the ancient bridge as the Blade Master attempted to create distance. His blade traced patterns of mathematical precision through the rain, each move calculated to control space and tempo. The knight simply kicked dirty water into his eyes, their darkened blade crashing through his guard like a fallen tree through temple walls. Lightning revealed the Blade Master's expression as he finally understood. There was no doctrine to counter, no school to overcome, no refined technique to surpass. The knight fought with the desperate practicality of one who had learned battle rather than blade work. Every dirty trick, every crude technique, every dishonorable tactic had been bought with blood and pain rather than practice and philosophy. The rain continued to fall as they crashed together again, perfect skill meeting brutal pragmatism on the storm-racked bridge. Thunder growled overhead like the gods themselves passing judgment on this clash of east and west, of art and war, of perfection and practicality. The storm raged as two forms clashed on ancient stone. The lightning of the storm intensified, splitting cracks which seemed to match every blow, illuminating a dance of blade and armor in stark bursts of brilliance. The Blade Master's centuries crashed against the knight's brutality like waves against unyielding rock. Each exchange stripped away another layer of certainty. The Blade Master's strike targeted a precise weak point in the knight's guard, only to meet an armored forearm that knocked his perfect blade aside. His riposte flowed like water, until a gauntleted fist crashed into his face, sending him reeling on moss-slick stone. Thunder shook loose more ancient mortar as the knight pressed forward. Their blade work remained crude, almost insulting in its simplicity. Yet each wild swing forced the Blade Master to defend against not just steel, but boots and elbows and armored knees. Every perfect parry left him open to a mailed fist or an armored shoulder. The Blade Master's robes hung in tatters now, crimson darkening to burgundy where blood mixed with rain. His breathing came in ragged gasps as he tried to maintain proper form against this assault that ignored all rules of engagement. Lightning revealed his expression, now more alive than it had ever been. shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension with each bloody exchange. Here was a warrior who had never spent decades perfecting a single strike. Instead, they had learned to turn every part of themselves into a weapon. Their armor was not ceremonial protection, but another tool in their arsenal. Even the environment served their purpose. The treacherous footing that should have hampered them instead became another advantage as they used their weight to add momentum to blows that no arm could confer. The Blade Master's blade sang through the air in a perfect arc that would have ended any conventional duel. The knights simply stepped inside the striker's range, letting the flat of the blade skid off their blackened armor. Their own sword stayed low, pointing at the ground like a common laborer's tool. No art, no refinement, no respect. Only purpose. Lightning flashed again as the knight's pommel smashed into the Blade Master's sword hand. Perfect muscle memory meant nothing against shattered fingers. His blade, the product of technology centuries advanced beyond this primitive world, clattered against ancient stone as his nerveless hand released it. Thunder answered as the knight's crude weapon swept toward his neck. The Blade Master's empty hand rose in a precisely executed deflection, only to meet unyielding steel rather than flesh or fabric. Pain lanced through his arm as thoroughly as the blade. The knight's next strike caught him in the temple with the flat of their blade. The Blade Master's perfect footwork finally failed as he stumbled on the rain-slicked bridge. His back met ancient stone with bone-crunching force, driving the last breath from his lungs. Above him, the knight's dark form loomed against a storm-torn sky. As consciousness faded, understanding bloomed in the Blade Master's mind. He had spent centuries pursuing perfection in a single aspect of combat, while his opponent had turned their entire existence into a weapon. His quest for the perfect strike meant nothing against one for whom any strike would do. The rain continued to fall as his vision dimmed. Thunder rolled across the ancient bridge where art had met artifice. In his last moment of awareness, the Blade Master concluded, "A true master of the blade is not bound by it." Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating two figures on the storm-racked bridge. One broken against rain-slick stone, the other dark against the raging sky. The knight turned away as the ancient stones shook. Their heavy boots left clear prints in the gathering water as they resumed their guard, undeterred, unfazed, as if nothing had truly happened, as if the Blade Master were no more than a common beast. Behind them, crimson robes slowly faded to the same dark red as the moss-stained rock beneath. The storm raged on, as indifferent to death as the Black Knight himself.